The UFC had another fight night card in the Apex this past weekend, and after the main event wrapped up between Roman Dolidze and Marvin Vettori, the UFC Twitter account made a post, I guess like kind of mocking the UFC fans, MMA fans who think the Apex Fight Night cards are boring, citing the fact that there were 9 finishes. So if the fighters are going out there, putting on good performances, it couldn't possibly be like a boring or bad product. Now, I understand this is probably like one person putting this post out, the social media manager, whoever it is, but I do think it just shows a clear disconnect between the UFC and how they view the Apex compared to the fans and even the fighters thrown in there. A week or two ago, Mark Shapiro, who is TKO's president, he came out and was talking about the Apex. He said that when you're watching on TV, you can't tell if you're in a stadium or an arena or if you're at the mighty Apex. So pretty much saying like there's no difference in the quality, the environment, whether you're at a stadium with 10, 15,000 people or you're at the Apex with 50. Now, I think any person with a functioning brain knows that that is a delusional statement. It's a crazy thing to say because people complain about the environment all the time. You can clearly tell that you're in the Apex versus when you're actually at an arena or a stadium. And so I kind of just want to talk about the reasons why I think the Apex is bad and why I think long-term it's just not a great solution here for the UFC. So I've kind of boiled it down to 3 main reasons why I dislike the Apex and why I think it's just, a bad trend for the UFC to have events here. Number 1 is I think it really hurts the ability to build up fighters and also build up stars. There have been some recent conversations about how the UFC is kind of at a star shortage right now where, your guys like Conor McGregor, John Jones, they're not active. The biggest active star is probably Alex Pereira. He no longer has the belt, and it just doesn't seem like you have a ton of these like up and coming rising stars. And I think the fact that we've been in the Apex for the last 4 or 5 years is a big part of that. So that's the first reason. My second reason is I just think it's depressing for the fighters. And then number 3, from like a fan perspective, it really is just kind of like a dead viewing experience. So we'll start off by talking about my number 1, which is hurting the ability to build up the fighters and build up stars. I want to run through some of the 2019 fight nights because I think some people who are newer fans and like all they know is having a lot of the fight nights in the Apex. There was a time before COVID where they were putting on the same number of events, a ton of fight nights. You had the pay-per-views, obviously, which were, not in the Apex, in real stadiums. But every single fight night that they were putting on were in a new location, whether it was somewhere in the US, traveling all across the world. And so these are the ones that I found from 2019 where there was a fighter who was directly tied to the location they were fighting in. In today's UFC, like you're maybe getting 3, 4, 5 of those cards in a year in terms of fight nights. These were all the ones in 2019. We had Korean Zombie fighting in South Korea. We had Jacare Souza main eventing in Brazil. These are main events, by the way. Zabit Magomed Sharapov main eventing in Russia. You had Jack Hermanson main eventing in Denmark. Yair Rodriguez in Mexico. Zhang Weili challenging for a title in China. Like she came across as a superstar, knocking out Andrade, winning the belt in that fight. The one co-main I will say was Uriah Faber. He was a co-main event in Sacramento, which the main event on this card wasn't great, but if you listen to the crowd when Uriah Faber knocks out Ricky Simone, like it might be the loudest moment in UFC history. The crowd goes insane because they have that connection to Uriah Faber. We had Gustafsson in Sweden. We had Alexei Oleinik in Russia, Darren Till in London, Jan Blachowicz in the Czech Republic, which, if my geography is correct, I believe is right next to Poland, where he is from. And then we had an all-Brazilian main event between Assunção and Moraes take place in Brazil. These fight nights that are catered around the fighters, catered around certain locations, they're able to create these like star moments. People remember the McGregor-Brandao fight in Ireland. Like McGregor came across as a superstar, and that fight night main event was a huge building block for that. And even if, the guy doesn't win or like the hometown fighters don't pull through, it's still gaining a ton of hype. The fighters are, getting that attention from the fans. The fans are actually invested in the cards. The local fans are getting invested in their fighters, really kind of building that fan base around them. So I do think, not having a ton of cards outside the Apex is hurting the ability to build up these fighters. Because I feel like the Apex cards, they just are thrown in and people aren't really building on their star power unless you just have some sort of insane high level performance where you're able to break out of the warehouse. The number 2 reason I talked about, it's depressing for fighters. The UFC is and markets itself as the premier MMA organization. And if that is the case, and if that's who you want to be, if that's who you think you are, why do you have high level fighters, supposedly the best in the world, fighting in front of like 50 to 100 people? There are fighters who are probably coming in from the regional scene. You're fighting on the regional scene, however you're coming in, whether it's through like the Contender Series, Tough, just getting a shot. They are probably fighting in front of much bigger crowds on those regional shows compared to them actually getting into the UFC and fighting in the Apex. Like, you have high level guys, top 5 fighters, men and women, who are main eventing in front of like 100 people when they should be fighting in front of like, thousands, 10K plus. And the UFC has the ability, they have the marketability to sell out, all those cards. It seems like every week they're out of the Apex, they're setting some sort of gate record. And so I just think that's disappointing, right? You hit the big stage and you're just not really getting, that opportunity to actually fight on the big stage because you're just fighting in the Apex. Also, one thing that just doesn't get talked about, but I think is kind of crazy, the octagon is smaller in the Apex. It is a 25-foot octagon in the Apex compared to 30 outside of it. And like I said, it just doesn't get mentioned. To me, that seems kind of crazy. Like any other sport, you change the dimensions of like the field. Like all of a sudden, the soccer field is smaller, or the NFL field is only 80, 90 yards. The 3-point line is changed. Like, this can affect fights. It affects the way you manage distance, kind of move around the cage. So not talked about, but I do think that is a factor. Like, it should be a uniform cage wherever you're fighting. And even if that's within the Apex, like, they should find a way to get a 30-footer in there. And then also, I just think these fighters deserve the bigger spotlight. They're just not getting that in the Apex compared to, the fighters who are able to fight on pay-per-views or the few fight nights that are actually outside of the UFC. And then the third reason I talked about, more from the fan perspective, it's just a dead viewing experience. There is no excitement for these cards, both like leading up to it and when they're actually taking place. Like, as someone who's watching every single card, it's just like pretty much locked into my schedule. Like, this is what I'm going to be watching. But like, I'm not excited to turn on the Roman Dolidze, Marvin Vettori Apex card. Like, it just doesn't do anything for me. I'm watching it. I feel like I'm just kind of going through the motions, even in a card, which, like the UFC mentioned, had 9 finishes. If that's in some other location in an arena, I'm probably hyped up. I'm enjoying it. The crowd's going crazy. It's building fight after fight. You just don't get that in the Apex. Also, it's kind of just given the UFC the ability to just phone it in. If they have to sell tickets, they're traveling around the world, they need to put on higher quality cards with better matchups. They just don't need to do that in the Apex because they don't need to sell tickets, or they're able to sell like the 50 to 100 in terms of people that actually show up there. And there's just such a clear difference between the Apex and the non-Apex cards. And I think something that's not talked about enough is the fact that you don't need to have these crazy stacked cards when you're traveling around. It makes it seem better when the cards are connected to the location. So the one I reference is, I believe it was the Mexico card, like around a year ago, where the first 2 fights were amazing. It was the Brandon Moreno, Brandon Royval main event, and then the co-main was Ortega Yair. So top 2 fights were amazing for a fight night. But outside of that, there was not another ranked fighter on the card, and people were talking about this like it was one of the most stacked fight nights of all time. Now, part of it is just because a lot of the fight nights suck when they're in the Apex and there's just not a ton of big names, but it just felt bigger because the fighters were connected to the location. And so when people are always dumping on the Apex cards and, how they're not stacked, I think they would be a lot more palatable if they were based around the person in the main event. Like, if this card was in Georgia and you were just running this card out here, obviously some of the fights would be different. You would be trying to get the Georgian guys on the card, but I think it would come across better if this was Roman Dolidze main eventing against Marvin Vettori in Georgia, or if it was, Marvin Vettori main eventing in Italy. I just think it would, come through better for the fans, and there wouldn't be as much criticism for like how weak and thin these cards are. So those are kind of like my 3 biggest reasons here. I do hope the UFC moves on from the Apex. I think the Apex is a great thing. It was a great thing during COVID, right? They were able to put on these events. I think it's awesome for the Contender Series. I think it's awesome for the Ultimate Fighter. But it's time to move out, for the big show, the real UFC events, for the fans, for the fighters, for everyone. I do hope they move on. It seems like they've kind of just settled into like, oh, they can save money doing this. But I do think in the long run, like, you might be saving money now, but you're losing out on the ability to really build up your product, bring in new fans, build up, new stars. And I think in the long run, it's going to be a net negative. But that's all I've got for you guys today. Let me know your thoughts on the Apex. Are you a fan? Are you against it? Do you want to see it gone? If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.